Well, first of all, I'd like to thank everybody for coming today on a beautiful sunny afternoon after all the rain in Vancouver. So I know you could be outdoors having a beautiful afternoon on the plaza or elsewhere. So thank you very much for coming. But this is a very important public forum, and we have a lot of information and activities to pack into this meeting this afternoon, and we have a brief time. So I'm going to jump right into it. This is a public forum that's been organised by the federal NDP, and we have a number of members of parliament who are here today, who I'll introduce in a few moments. And I think, as you know from the invitation, this public forum is going to focus particularly on the Enbridge pipeline and the tankers on BC's coast. This is, of course, a major issue for us all in British Columbia, and there are many other issues that are involved too. So I know that we have a lot to talk about this afternoon, and we do have a very packed agenda. I'm going to explain the agenda in a couple of minutes, but what I would first like to do is to invite Carleen Thomas, who is an elected council member for the Tsawwassen Nation, to come up and give us a blessing. So, Carleen, thank you for being here.
Asiam Nitsiaya, I Tenishqualawan, Quatsi Quatsnala Ihui, and the Ansachalot, and the Manas and Thalia eat Siakmak Slachot Siam, and the Emeth Quath Ansachalot, Quaslachot Siam. Hyde Sebka, Meet Coquitlam to Vancouver. My dear relatives and friends, the feelings I have inside are really good to be with you here today. And in Coast Salish protocol, I introduced myself to you with my ancestral name. I am Ansachalot. I also mentioned who my parents are and my grandparents are, as Coast Salish protocol dictates. My parents are Ernie and Deanna George. My father is the current hereditary chief of our nation, and my grandparents are the late John L. George and Lillian George, and my grandfather was obviously the last hereditary chief. And I welcomed you here to our homeland in Vancouver. I've been asked to say a blessing, so I would ask you to please rise. Creator, grandmothers and grandfathers, we give thanks for this day. We give thanks for the people you've gathered here this afternoon. We ask you to bless us with open minds and open hearts as we carry on with the work that is placed before us. We ask you to especially bless all of our elders and our youth. We ask you to bless the families of those of us who are traveling and who are far away from home. We ask you to listen to, and we leave with you our intentions. For these and the intentions we have close to our hearts, we leave with you this afternoon, all my relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carleen. It's a good way to begin our meeting. Now, the meeting today is going to happen in three parts. We're going to hear from a couple of our MPs. Then we're going to have a panel discussion, and then we actually want to have some smaller group discussions. So again, this is a lot to pack into an afternoon because we have to be out of here by 3:30. But I'd like to begin just by introducing some of the members of Parliament who are here today. They're all BC NDP members of Parliament. I'm delighted that they're here. First of all, we have Kennedy Stewart. Kennedy, if you'd like to... Burnaby-Douglas, and is the Critic for Science and Technology. And we have Peter Julian, who's the MP for Burnaby-New, Westminster. And he is our Energy and Natural Resources Critic. And we have Jinny Sims, Jinny, who is MP for New North Delta, and she's our Immigration, Citizenship and Multiculturalism Critic. Jasbir Sandhu from Surrey North, who's our Asia Pacific Gateway Critic. Finn Donnelly, who's the MP for New Westminster-Coquitlam, who is our Western Economic Diversification Critic and also Fisheries Critic for the West Coast, and Alex Adamanenko, who came all the way from BC Southern Interior, where he's the introduce myself. I'm Libby Davies. I'm the Member of Parliament for Vancouver. And I left our wonderful guest till the end, who's come all the way from Halifax, and that's Megan Leslie, who is our environment critic and represents the riding of Halifax. So Megan, where did you go? There she is. As you can see, Megan came with her suitcase in tow, and she's on a visit to British Columbia, and a number of the MPs are not only here in Vancouver today for this forum about Enbridge and the pipeline, but also a number of MPs are going to be traveling to Kitimat Village and to the Skeena area to take part in the review panel hearing, to observe what's going on, to meet with local organizations. So there's a lot that's planned for the next day or two. So I know that Megan and the other MPs who are going will be very, very busy. What we're going to do this afternoon is we're going to hear from Peter Julian, who is our natural resources critic, who will just give a little bit of an overview, and then we will hear a presentation from Megan Leslie, and then we do have a panel of NGOs who are here today, who are going to give us some more detailed information about the Enbridge situation and what's going on, and because there are some pretty amazing campaigns going on. So we will have a panel discussion that I'll introduce, and then, as I mentioned, we will have, we hope, time to have an opportunity to break into smaller groups, to have a more detailed discussion, and then hopefully, if time permits, we'll have a quick report back. So that's how the afternoon looks for the next couple of hours. So what I'd like to do now is to invite Peter Julian to come up, our natural resources critic, just to give a bit of an overview. Peter.
Thanks. I'll be brief because we do have a lot of work to do this afternoon. But I wanted to preface the meeting today with the impact of Bill C-38. And all of you may have followed the marathon voting sessions that took place a couple of weeks ago. Who actually watched overnight with 24 hours? Some of you did? Okay, wonderful. Thank you. It was a 24-hour voting session that followed several weeks of hearings that we forced onto Bill C-38. But the implications of Bill C-38, I think, are obvious to so many of us who've read the bill and have heard of what is actually in it. One of the implications of Bill C-38 is that environmental assessments at the federal level, according to the Environment Commissioner, will go from 4,000 to 6,000 on an annual basis to 20 to 30. In other words, over 99% of federal environmental assessments will simply disappear. Another aspect of Bill C-38 that we fought in the House of Commons is the fact that now, essentially, you have the government making the decision about who can testify or not testify in front of the National Energy Board. The phrase that the Conservative government has been using is the term direct impact. And when Megan and myself and other members of the NDP subcommittee dealing with C-38 and the implications around fisheries and the environment questioned Conservative ministers about what direct impact may mean, Joe Oliver said, well, for example, talking about climate change, I mean, that is not an issue that we think is relevant to hearings around the National Energy Board. These are the types of implications that come with Bill C-38. That's why we fought the bill, and that's why we'll continue to do the public education that is so vitally important in the coming months. Today is your opportunity as the public to give us feedback about the best way to highlight these kinds of implications and the best way for the federal NDP to fight back against the Enbridge proposal, which we all know creates 78 full-time on-site jobs, but risks thousands of jobs, fisheries, environmental tourism, and of course threatens our environment. So we're looking forward to the discussion, looking forward to your feedback. We know we have a lot of very talented people in the room, so we're hoping, particularly in the round tables, to get all the best possible comments that you can provide to us, suggestions, strategies on how to fight back on the Enbridge pipeline, and how, as well, to look at the issues around Kinder Morgan and other possible pipeline applications that may be coming forward. So thank you so much for coming out today. We look forward to your feedback.
you very much, Peter. We're going to hear from Megan, and after Megan, we are going to also hear from Rob Fleming, who is here, who is the environment critic for the Provincial NDP, and who's the MLA for Victoria Swan Lake. Rob, there you are. So we're going to invite you up after Megan, just so you can be ready. But it gives me great pleasure to introduce Megan Leslie. As you've heard, Megan is our environment critic, the member for Halifax, and Megan has really been in the thick of the battles in Ottawa, whether it's been over Bill C-38 and how it's torn to shreds all of our existing environmental assessment regulations and processes, and has been very involved in the work we've done in Ottawa to kind of push back on the Harper government. So Megan, being here in Vancouver today and in British Columbia, we're really, really happy that you're here. We know that you've had a lot of contact with a lot of the groups, as you said earlier, via email. So to have you here in person and to have this kind of face-to-face discussion is really, really important. So we're very glad that you're visiting Vancouver. And so please, everybody, welcome Megan Leslie, the member for Halifax.
Wow, Vancouver, that in the middle of the day, there's this many folks out at a pipeline meeting. You guys are great. And before I get started, these postcards, my suitcase is here, a third of it is filled with postcards. So please feel free to take more than one, hand them out to your friends, send one to me, put a sticker over another one, send it to Stephen Harper, do what you need to do with them, we've got tons. I want to say thanks very much for coming out here today, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about why I'm here and what it is that we're trying to accomplish. Last month I had the extraordinary privilege to do an oil sands tour with our leader Tom Mulcair, and so I got to see firsthand the site, where they're doing in situ, where they're doing the mining, where they're extracting this bitumen. And I thought it was only appropriate then to do a trip here and a tour in BC to talk to folks here, but also to see the proposed pipeline path, to see the proposed tanker path with my own eyes, and act the opposite of the Conservatives and actually talk to people and actually consult with people, maybe even listen to people. So that's really why I'm here. And when I'm heading up north, I'll be meeting with First Nations leaders, I'll be meeting with elected officials who are trying to make their communities better, I'll be meeting with social entrepreneurs, trying to engage their communities, and I'm going to be meeting with radical activists, environmental activists. It's true, I'm going to be doing it. But you know, I think it's important for us as elected officials to stay in touch with people and to actually talk to people and listen. Because, I mean, we in this room, when I say we know what's happening in our communities. We live in our communities. We know what's going on in our communities. But if you'll let me be partisan for a second, I think that Stephen Harper wants us to believe something different. He wants to tell us that we don't understand our communities. They don't believe in this truth of our communities. They're trying to construct us in a certain way. They're constructing this story about Canadians that it's okay for industry to use our lakes and our backyards as a dumping ground. They're constructing a story for us, telling us that we are afraid and we want people to be locked up. They're constructing a story that says that we want to punish people and we'd rather spend money on F-35s and pipelines than spend money on health care, or, God forbid, a child care system. And they're constructing this narrative, but we know better because we live in our communities and we know that's not the truth on the ground. So Julian mentioned the budget, and I don't know how closely you've been following this budget, but 3 years ago, we would never have recognized this budget as being a Canadian budget. We would never have recognized it. Do you remember when there was federal money for energy efficiency? Do you remember that? It wasn't that long ago. And energy efficiency that created jobs in every single one of our communities, energy efficiency that helped us make life more affordable, and energy efficiency projects that reduced our greenhouse gas emissions. Well, now there is $0 in this budget for energy efficiency. And do you remember 3 years ago, 2 years ago, when there used to be money for renewables? Remember that? Now there's nothing in this budget for renewables. I'm from Nova Scotia, And we are experimenting with tidal and lowered this giant turbine into the Bay of Fundy. And within weeks, the turbine blew apart. That is not a failure. That is a mark of true success. The tides are so powerful, we didn't even know they were that powerful. And we are a country of wind and waves and tide and solar, and we're not investing in this. This budget is an oil sands budget, and it's a pipeline budget. Think about it for a second. So if you're the Minister of Pipelines, and you want to get rid of all barriers to pipelines, what do? Well, if you don't want evidence, you get rid of the National Roundtable for Environment and Economy. If you don't want science, you make cuts to Environment Canada. If you don't want those pesky rivers, they're getting in the way, so let's just rewrite the Fisheries Act and take out habitat protection. We don't want warnings about tankers and our coastlines, so let's get rid of the Oil Spill Response Center, and let's get rid of Kitsilano Coast Guard, right? We don't want that pesky warnings. We don't want democratic oversight of these projects, so let's get rid of people being able to testify at them. We don't want dissent, so let's start a witch hunt against environmental organizations. And just in case we missed a hurdle, just in case there's still something that would say, no, this pipeline shouldn't go through, Stephen Harper has written in that final say for pipeline projects, and I can see you're all nodding because you know this. It goes to Cabinet. This Cabinet, Bevoda. I heard that. Peter MacKay, Peter Kent, Tony Clement, this Cabinet. They have final say. Could you imagine this happening a few years ago? I can't. It's not a budget that I recognize as a Canadian budget. So I'm not going to lie. It can be hard to stay positive when you are the environment critic for the official opposition, but I am positive. I take strength in our communities. When I go home to Halifax or when I come to communities across Canada, I take strength in how community is responding, in the incredible innovative projects happening at the community level. It fuels me and it inspires me because there is incredible work happening around this country. As you know, Enbridge is proposing a pipeline that's over 1,100 kilometers long. It's going to pump raw bitumen across hundreds of lakes and streams, salmon-bearing lakes and streams, through pristine rainforests, only to be shipped along BC's beautiful north coast in super tankers bigger than the Exxon Valdez at a rate of 220 a year. The environmental impacts of the spill cannot be understated. So many of us in this room, I know we have organized successful campaigns in the past. I know there's a wealth of experience in this room, even though I don't know all of you. I know what some of your backgrounds are. We've done this before, and we know what needs to be done. It needs to be everything we can think of, from the letters to the editor, to the protests, to the creative media events, to teaching our children about it, to street theater, to brown bag luncheons in our workplace, to op-eds in the newspapers, letters to your MPs, postcards to your MPs and to the Prime Minister. And we also do need some elected officials who will be brave, who will take the right position, and who will be informed on this issue, and who will help community act. So that's why we're here. We're here to listen, to learn, to have good discussion, and to come up with some of those creative ways that we can think about what are our next steps. How do we engage more people, the people who aren't in this room? How do we engage them in this big national project as well? So thank you for letting me be a part of this and letting me be here to learn. And I really look forward to the discussion today.
Very much, Megan, for your leadership on this issue. And now I'd like to introduce Rob Fleming, who I said is the environment critic for the Provincial NDP and the MLA for Victoria Swan Lake. Rob.
Thank you, Libby. Thank you very much for the chance to participate in this forum. And I just want to say, maybe at the outset, on behalf of Adrian Dix and the 35 NDP MLAs that are part of the BC NDP caucus, how grateful we are for the fight that was waged by the official opposition, by all of our NDP MPs, and especially the energy of Megan Leslie and our BC NDP team of members of Parliament. It was a phenomenal fight. I did stay up and watch. Finn said, "Get a life." But the stakes were huge, and it was something that we tried to suggest the importance of for British Columbia in the BC legislature while the debate was going on in the House of Commons. And we have a provincial government in BC that operates under a principle that no matter how bad and no matter how far against the public interest of British Columbia a federal conservative policy is, Premier Christy Clark and her cabinet have some kind of gag order that thou shalt never criticize the federal conservatives. And Bill C-38, I think, disproportionately affects British Columbia's future more than any other province. Of course, it affects all of Canada, but it is our coastline. It is the environmental risk posed by Enbridge that is enabled by that legislation that is at greatest risk. And Peter and mentioned the dismantling now of the Canadian Environmental Assessment Agency and the act that governs federal environmental assessments, and we have not come to grips in British Columbia yet with what a post-Bill C-38 world looks like. Peter mentioned that we will go from thousands of environmental assessments in Canada where the CEAA is involved down to perhaps just a few dozen. And let me give you an illustration of what that might mean and why we feared the passage of Bill C-38 and tried to get the BC Liberal Environment Minister and the Premier to make some kind of comment, because surely they had teams of lawyers and civil servants giving them analysis of what this meant for British Columbia, but they wouldn't bite on that. But what it means, if we can just go back a couple of years to a very controversial mining proposal by a mining company called Taseko, Fish Lake, do you remember? Just a couple of years ago. In fact, it's under reapplication right now. But in that case, the federal agency did its job, and they turned the mine down. They said it was predicated on the destruction of an entire ecosystem, and the project was unsupportable. And then Minister Prentice refused to approve it. And why that's important is that it was a dual environmental assessment at the time. And the province of British Columbia gave the same project, analyzing the same application, a green light. That mine, that lake, would be drained today. The mine would be under active development and drilling if we had a single provincially led environmental assessment process, and that's what we're going to have now. So we need to think about that. The province of British Columbia does not have the capacity, I'm afraid to say, to conduct robust, scientifically sound and comprehensive environmental assessments today. This is an agency that has an $8.9 million budget, which is about $2 million less than Christy Clark's Premier's office, their communications staff and such. Trying to get a handle on reviewing an estimated $35 to $40 billion worth of economic development projects in the province of BC. It is just not going to happen, and something's going to give, and if the Liberal record is any proof of what that might be, here in British Columbia, it's going to be the environment that is sacrificed. So those are the stakes. What I will say that is positive, echoing what many MPs have said, is that if Stephen Harper thought that it was smart politics to ram through Bill C-38, if he thought that was somehow satisfying his political base, from what I've seen in every corner of British Columbia, and I've recently been up to Alex Adamanenko's area, he's sorely wrong. He is alienating people who voted Conservative, who have told me as the environment critic for BC that they will never vote Conservative again. And that includes rod and gun clubs and the BC Wildlife Federation, who wrote strongly worded letters in opposition to Bill C-38. And I would say to Stephen Harper and Christy Clark, if she thinks it's smart politics to say nothing while the federal government did this to British Columbia, I know the Prime Minister will be watching very carefully in May 2013 just to see what a smart political move he did by pushing through in the most anti-democratic fashion Bill C-38. And I hope the next provincial election will be run on the environment. I think the Enbridge pipeline obviously is going to be the largest issue in many voters' minds. It will still be before the National Energy Board. And where Christy Clark hasn't been clear at all and has sat on the fence on Enbridge, the BC NDP and our leader Adrian Dix have been absolutely clear. And if you haven't had a chance to review it yet, we have an 11-page submission to the National Energy Board where we make the case about why no to Enbridge is the right position for British Columbia. We'll keep working with our MPs, but here in British Columbia, to have the government step off the fence and actually use its intervener status in the National Energy Board hearings to stand up for British Columbia. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Rob, and you're so right. They may have won the votes, but they sure as heck didn't win public opinion and public support. So we do have an ongoing battle on this issue. I'd now like to introduce the next section of our forum today, which is to hear from a number of panelists. We're very delighted today to be joined, well, first of all, by Carleen Thomas, who gave the blessing earlier, who's representing the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. So, Carleen, if you'd like to come up. And also, we'll be hearing from Ben West from the Wilderness Committee. Ben, are you here? Yep, okay. Christian Wilhelmsen from the Georgia Strait Alliance, if you'd like to come up, and Karen Riston from Living Oceans. So what I'm going to suggest is that, let's look at the time now, 2:30, so if each of you would like to take maybe 5 minutes to let us know what you're doing in terms of the Enbridge pipeline. You're welcome to sort of expand onto other issues if you want, but certainly that's the focus of the meeting. And then when we've heard from the panelists, we're going to immediately break into some smaller groups a week so that you can be involved in some discussion and feedback. So there's no particular order. Is there anybody who would like to go first?
I'd like to go last.
You'd like to go last. All right. Carleen's going last. Okay.
Maybe we just did thumb wars. I'm actually going to start by talking about the other pipeline, just to give some context. So I'm Christiane Wilhelmsen. I'm the executive director at the Georgia Strait Alliance. The Georgia Strait Alliance for over 20 years has been a community-based organization that spoke out for issues that were relevant to communities around the Georgia Basin region, from pulp mills that dump dioxins to sewage for municipalities. We've often listened to communities as to what they're concerned about and about the health of the Georgia Strait region. And right now, the issue that is of greatest concern to most of the people we talk to is the twinning of the Trans Mountain pipeline and the potential to increase diluted bitumen tankers dramatically in this region. However, a difference between the Enbridge proposal and the Kinder Morgan proposal is that the threat to the region is already here. We have diluted bitumen tankers in these waters. But most notably, these tankers have been here and they have been increasing not only in number, but in the volume of diluted bitumen, and that has happened without any public consultation or public knowledge. It came to mind because one particularly observant person happened to be noticing more tankers and started to look into it. So in 2010, we had 71 tankers, which had increased from about 10 tankers. This is over a year in 2003. So this is very dramatic. Now we have officially heard the proposal from Kinder Morgan that they're proposing to twin the Trans Mountain pipeline from the tar sands to the Westridge terminal in Burnaby, increasing the number of barrels a day from 300,000 to potentially 800,000. Another almost 900 kilometers of pipeline through British Columbia. And expanding the terminal itself will, of course, impact Burnaby residents as well. Citizens are extremely concerned about this, and the reason is, unlike people who live in Ottawa, and unlike people who live in Alberta, we know what's at risk if a tanker has even the smallest accident in our waters, whether it's Burrard Inlet, Georgia Strait, or anywhere in the Salish Sea. There is more diversity of wildlife in the Strait of Georgia than anywhere in coastal British Columbia. We have less than 90 endangered southern resident killer whales, hundreds of birds, hundreds of fish, including our 5 salmon species. We have the diversity. I could spend my 5 minutes all on that. And in the Salish Sea region, the number of at-risk species has doubled in the last 3 years to 113. This is everything from threatened to endangered. But the risks to our region are not just ecological, they're also economic. As was mentioned, our tourism, fisheries, and recreational economic drivers in this Georgia Basin region are massive. In 2011, tourism contributed $7 billion to the GDP and about 130,000 jobs. None of this is ever calculated into the so-called benefits we get from more tar sands coming to our region. No one ever wants to talk about what we will lose. And when we talk about the cost of a spill, we all know, you've probably heard this, that a spill, even a good spill cleanup, maybe will clean up 10 to 20% of the oil. But no one's ever done the actual calculations. What's a spill going to do to our waters? But luckily, in Washington State, they have done the calculations. A few years ago, the Department of Ecology looked at what a spill costs. And it could cost, in their terms, in Washington, 165,000 jobs and almost $11 billion. There's no reason to believe that those numbers wouldn't equate here in British Columbia. So decisions are being made in British Columbia writ large, whether you're in a northern community or here in the south, and they're fundamentally wrong because they promote a dependence on fossil fuels at a time when what we need to be doing is investing in alternative energies. Can you imagine for a moment what $5 billion, the cost of the Kinder Morgan doubling twinning project, could do if invested in alternative energy? It's wonderful to think about for a moment. It's kind of exciting. But we keep getting the false dilemma that you can't talk about alternatives unless you don't use fossil fuels yourself personally, which I find rather an insulting. But also, I think the other risk is, of course, that it's going to put coastal communities at risk. And I think whether it's economic, social, or environmental, we have far too much to lose to let the Kinder Morgan proposal go forward. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Karen Riston. I'm the Executive Director at Living Oceans Society. Living Oceans is an intervener in the Enbridge pipeline proposal, and so my comments are going to be devoted to talking about tankers, but talking about tankers in the aggregate, because between the Kinder Morgan proposal that Christian's just explained to you and Enbridge, we're going to be looking at upwards of 700 more tankers plying the BC coast every year. That's not a number you've heard before, probably, if you've been reading what Enbridge and Kinder Morgan are putting out. But if you read what the pipeline's capacity is in each case and figure out how many tankers that can fill, that's how many tankers we're talking about. The trick has been to advance the proposal using a lower number for output, when in fact, with the addition of a couple of pumping stations on both the pipelines, they can easily increase capacity by as much as 60% over what they're disclosing. This means that the whole basis on which the risk assessment is proceeding for tanker traffic on the coast is fundamentally flawed, and flawed to the extent of perhaps 60% or more. The size of vessels we're talking about are the very large crude carriers and for those of you not familiar with this, tankers are described in terms of the ports that they can access properly. So Aframax and Suezmax are the technical names of the tankers we're expecting. In practical terms, that means up to 2 to 3 million barrels of oil in a single tanker. That's a very large crude carrier. The routes that these boats are planned to be taking are, to say the least, tortuous. Unfortunately, we don't have AV capacity here so that I can show you the maps, but picture Haida Gwaii essentially being encircled by tanker routes. Picture them penetrating deep up the fjord into Douglas Channel and up to Kitimat, and you'll know what I mean. There are no fewer than 5 dogleg turns on the route into Kitimat that these tankers are expected to take, and some of them in passages that are no wider than 2 miles. When you compound the tortuousness of the route itself with the fact that it is not charted according to merchant marine specifications as yet, and the fact that it's subject to some of the worst weather of any part of our BC coastline, you'll understand that it's considered a nightmare by experienced tanker captains. We have been led to believe that we can take some solace from the fact that these tankers will be double-hulled, but in fact, I see a few of you laughing, I'm not telling you anything new. There have been a number of accidents with double-hulled tankers. They do tend to prevent spillage being as great as might occur from a single hull tanker, but they have their own set of unique problems attached to them. As soon as regulations required that international shipping of oil be done in double-hulled tankers, the people who designed tankers quickly figured out that they could reduce the thickness of the steel they were using because they had a new design that was more rigid. So now you have two much thinner walls between the sea and the oil, and guess what? They're just as liable to be punctured as one thicker wall. In fact, in some cases, depending on the kind of accident, they're more liable to be punctured. Now, the way the oil is compartmentalized inside the ship will reduce the amount of spillage somewhat, but it does not prevent spillage. In addition, some of the unique characteristics of the new design make those ships more liable to stress and stress fractures happening. And you'll see some stunning photographs of double-hulled oil tankers that have simply broken in half. There's a wonderful video circulating on YouTube from Australia of an outraged member of government explaining how the front fell off one of the tankers. You really should look that one up. The losses, once that's happened, I might add, are easily equal to the Exxon Valdez. And in fact, it's the US Coast Guard calculated that had the Exxon Valdez been a double-hulled tanker, it still would have lost some 4 million barrels of oil. Barrels, no, I've lost that figure, it's not barrels, but it would have lost 25 to 60% of the oil that it did lose if it had been double-hulled. So they're not much of a protection. The operational risks are numerous. I've referred to some of them in terms of the tortuousness of the passage itself, but the bigger question is the safety measures, the mitigation measures that are being proposed. First of all, most of what Enbridge has proposed is either the law, according to international maritime law or Canadian law, or it's a measure that doesn't exist, would be great to have, but we're going to have to pay for. That would be things like traffic control, weather stations, monitoring, that sort of thing. Simply not in place. The final point I'd like to make is about cleanup technology. Tar sands bitumen is fundamentally different from the crude oil that we've unfortunately become somewhat used to hearing about spilling. It's highly unlikely that it's going to float. It can in some circumstances, but most of the time, it's either going to get emulsified in the water column or it's going to sink right to the bottom. The cleanup technology we have depends on the oil floating. A boom, a skimmer, they get it off the surface. If you're talking dispersants, they have to be applied to the oil while it's on the surface. Response times to get up to the north coast and apply dispersant in a weather horizon that's just right for applying dispersant, it's only a fraction of the time that these boats will actually be in the water that these kinds of measures could even be employed. And they're highly unlikely to be effective. As Christian mentioned, 10 to 20% is considered good cleanup for a conventional oil spill. We're talking about an oil spill for which the technology does not exist. And then there's the question, who pays? Under the current international scheme, we would have about $1.3 billion available to answer any one spill. And that's presuming a number of funds kick in along the way. By way of contrast, the Exxon Valdez cost $12.2 billion to clean up. Need I say more?
Thanks very much.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Ben West. I'm a campaigner for the Wilderness Committee based here in Vancouver. I'd like to start first of all by saying thanks to the Coast Salish Nations who've welcomed us onto their territory, and particularly to you, Carleen, for that beautiful prayer and greeting this morning. Thank you. I'd also like to thank Libby and Megan and everybody for organizing this forum and for the amount of work that I know that you've been doing on Bill C-38 and on this issue of pipelines and tankers, which is so important to the future of our country and to the future of this province. I also stayed up late watching that stuff, and it was exhausting to watch. I can only imagine what it was like to be there on the floor actually participating in that. So thank you so much for that work. And as was pointed out, Bill C-38 is very much a dream in the minds of the oil industry lobbyists. It's something that really reeks of being written by the oil industry and presented by their friends in Parliament, unfortunately. if you were somebody who was advocating for these pipelines and you were trying to get everything you could possibly get, you got that and then some when it came to Bill C-38. So it really was a sad day for democracy when that was brought through, and I really have faith that the people of Canada aren't going to put up with this kind of thing much longer. It's interesting that we, the opponents of these pipelines and tankers, are being called radicals. When I was in high school, I took a debate class where they taught us that the first thing you do is you take your weakness and you turn it into your strength. Whatever it is that's your biggest Achilles heel. Like, let's say, for example, you're taking your marching orders from a bunch of big oil companies in the United States, just hypothetically speaking. You then, take that and you turn it around and you blame your opponents for doing the exact same thing. And I mean, it just is amazing to me that the folks who are proposing these pipelines, who are, clearly working at the behest of some, very powerful forces, some big predominantly American oil companies, are accusing Canadians of taking money from Americans. At what point Stephen Harper became opposed to foreign direct investment or free trade, I'm not sure exactly, but but that's the reality we have right now. So what do we do about all this? And it's interesting that we're talking about the Enbridge pipeline as well as the Kinder Morgan pipeline, and I think that's something that we need to do more often in the same meetings. I think the worst case scenario is that we get a sort of divide and conquer strategy where it's the North versus the South, where it's people who want to protect the Great Bear versus people who want to protect their communities in the Lower Mainland. I mean, if you look at the arguments against these pipelines, they're pretty much the same. I mean, there's some very distinct things about each pipeline, of course, in terms of the localized impacts if there was a spill. But if you look at the arguments around Dutch disease, if you look at the arguments around the future of the economy of Canada, if you look at the arguments around the expansion of the oil sands, or Mordor, if you want to call it that, whatever you want to call it, the implications are the same. Even Dalton McGuinty, of all people, has started to become a spokesperson, sort of talking about the dangers to the Canadian economy if we continue down this road. And I think this is the right frame for us to be looking at this. We need to be looking at what is the way for Canada's economy to move forward. We can't just give up this ground and say, well, pipelines, sure, there's jobs, but the environment is at risk. It's not even good for the economy. Not only are there jobs at stake, but it just is not the strategic direction for us to move forward. It makes us a pariah on the world stage. We continue to win these Fossil of the Year awards. I think they're going to rename it the Stephen Harper Award soon. Because we're getting in the way of action to do something about climate change. And Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org, said, if you really want to talk about who the real radicals are, it's those who want to actually fundamentally change the chemistry of our atmosphere. I mean, that's pretty radical. Trying to conserve the status quo is not a radical act. That's a conservative act. So whatever terminology you want to use, I wouldn't call what we're doing radical. In fact, I would say it's quite the opposite. So in terms of raising awareness, in terms of spreading awareness and sort of doing the kind of grassroots action that needs to be done, there is a lot that's being done in the Lower Mainland right now, both around Enbridge and around the Kinder Morgan pipeline. It's yet to be seen whether the joint review panel hearings are actually going to happen in Vancouver and Victoria. I would assume that they would, but that's not a given at this point, given the potential retroactive application of the rules that have just been brought in by our federal government, unfortunately. So, I mean, I would assume that there's going to be a big push around the joint review panel hearings when and if they are happening, and if not, I'm sure we'll be holding our own meetings, and I would invite you all to help in that activity. And around the Kinder Morgan pipeline, I think we're kind of where the Enbridge pipeline was a couple of years ago. We're sort of at this early stage of building awareness. Most people haven't heard of the Kinder Morgan pipeline still, I can tell you. But there is a lot of work that's happening now to hold town hall meetings up and down the pipeline route around Burnaby Inlet. We have a number of reports that we're working on that try to do modeling and look at what the specific implications would be, say for Stanley Park or for Point Grey or for Burnaby. We have some events that we're going to be rolling out soon, and you can sign up on our mailing list that will float around to get information about all these different events, because I can't tell you about all of them right now. But what I can tell you is anecdotally, I've been doing this kind of work for about 10 years. I've never seen more people more upset about anything than they are about the idea of turning the west coast of Canada into a major export facility for the oil sands. Is there anybody in this room who supports these pipelines? Who here opposes these pipelines? Okay. Give yourself all a hand. All right, now you got to stop. I only got 5 minutes. I'll wrap up right now. So just anecdotally speaking, we printed 50,000 of these newspapers 2 months ago. I've got 2,000 left, and we just printed another 30,000. If you want more information about what's going on with both these pipelines, please do pick up a copy of this as well as the other materials that Georgia Strait and then Living Oceans have at the front. It's a good way to kind of get more informed and to start talking to our friends and neighbors, because that's really where this has to start. It's a grassroots effort for us to really make the change that's needed. So thank you all so much.
Thanks.
Good afternoon again. I'm just going to share a little bit about who we are. I live on the North Shore. Our band, our nation is called the Burrard Indian Band, our Burrard Inlet Indian Band. And the name we have for ourselves, we call ourselves Tsleil-Waututh. Tsleil-Waututh in our language means people of the inlet, referring to the Burrard Inlet that our people have lived on since time out of mind. About a decade ago or so, maybe 15 years, 18 years ago, we had to get into the treaty process. During that time, we were able to conduct a traditional use study. And what happened was we were building capacity within our own nation. We hired and trained our own people. We went out and we interviewed every Tsleil-Waututh person that ever walked, swam, canoed, hunted within our traditional territory. We have a world-class GIS department, and they created maps. And maps tell stories. Out of that work came a really wonderful phrase that my grandparents shared with us when they were asked about what the inlet meant to them or what they did on the inlet. And my grandfather said, when the tide went out, the table was set. Our people were able to walk down to the beach and harvest every kind of living animal that you could imagine, and plant life as well. So the Tsleil-Waututh people have an inherent right, and we have an inherent responsibility to protect Tsleil-Waututh, to protect that inlet. I understand at a lot of gatherings we don't talk much about Kinder Morgan or the oil tankers or anything, and I think it was because they didn't really come out with their announcement till earlier this year. We've had a lot of talk within our own community, and some of our members were even asking us, what are you going to do? Why aren't we doing anything yet? So, you other elected leaders out there, people are waiting. Your people are waiting for you to stand up and say, no, the risk is just too great. Getting back to the inlet, I'm just 51. I just became a grandma last year. Both my sons had a daughter each. And I think it just made me pause to reflect, think about what my grandmother did with me. And she would bring us down to the beach every other day, every day during the summer. And she would teach us how to harvest what we could, because in my lifetime, we could eat the clams and the oysters and the crabs and the mussels from the inlet. By my grandmother's time, the squatsi, the sea urchin, was already gone due to the industrialization and pollution within the inlet. But I thought, hey, I was pretty lucky to be able to, just go down to the beach and gather this stuff. So it made me think about, I can't teach. Didn't have the chance to teach my own children, but I think, when you're a parent raising your own kids, life's really busy. And in this time of our lives, we just had to go out and have jobs, paying jobs to support our families. And of course, soccer is huge on the North Shore, so our kids were all in soccer. I didn't have that opportunity to teach them, but I thought, I will never have the opportunity to teach my grandchildren the way my grandmother taught me. You know, we can still harvest crab, but the mollusks, the clams and the oysters and the mussels we can't harvest anymore. When I was talking about the risk, I don't know if you remember in 2007, I believe Kinder Morgan had that oil spill. And Tsleil-Waututh is very concerned. The response or the lack of emergency preparedness on all kinds of levels just really gives us cause for concern. Our people were the first out on the inlet, and we helped the different ministries and different organizations help gather the birds that were affected by the oil. I've been told they came to our department, or we were able to put maps down on the table, and my father knew the tides because my father is a canoe puller. He knew the tides so well that he could tell where that oil would touch ground. And sure enough, that's where it is. That's where it landed. We take our responsibility very, very seriously. Another program we have is the Marine Stewardship Program, where we test 18 or 16 different sites within the inlet, and we're gathering that data. We also have a stewardship policy where all different kinds of development that happens within our traditional territory must have a referral, must come to us. We must be the one to drive that vehicle to say, yes, it's safe to develop here, or this is what has to happen. You have to understand we're not anti-development. I mean, I know you were saying it is really insulting if you can't stand up and say no, no, no to oil when we're using fossil fuels, but we need to be responsible. We all have that inherent capability to be responsible, how to sustain ourselves. And I think at the grassroots level, that's what's missing. We don't get to go out on luxury yachts or, you know, fly halfway around the world for a vacation or what have you.
Carleen, can I ask you to start wrapping up, please?
Yes, absolutely. My point is we need to be a part of it, but we need to be responsible, much like my ancestors were and your ancestors were. We were responsible and we were accountable, and we took care of the land that sustained us. And I just will mention again that as leadership, when those young kids were asking me, why aren't you doing it? Why aren't we doing anything? They didn't point their fingers at me and say, why aren't you doing something? They said, why aren't we doing anything? And I'm pretty sure it's much like that in your own constituencies and communities. Why aren't we doing anything? So all you political leaders, got to stand up, use your voice. You have your communities behind you. Haitsapka, thanking all of you.
Thank you very much, Colleen, and to all of the panelists. I feel really terrible having rushed you so much, but you all did a great job of giving us really solid information in a short period of time. I would also like to just let everyone know that we did invite the Mayor of Vancouver, Gregor Robertson, and he wasn't able to come, but he did send a message thanking us for the invitation and making it clear that he supported the forum, and he sent his best wishes for a productive and successful forum. And I think we all know that Vancouver Council has been very active on this issue, so that's good to know. Now, folks, we're going to do a very fast shuffle and changeover here, because we do want to have an opportunity for everybody to have some further dialogue and discussion about these issues. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to break into 6 groups, and I'm going to name them. You're all going to help reorder the chairs very fast. We're going to have maybe a 25-minute discussion, and then one person in each group, if there's time, will be able to just very quickly make a summary to everybody who's still assembled. We know that Megan and other MPs who are going up north have to leave at 3:30. So if you see Megan and others leave, then please know it's because they're dashing out to the airport. And again, thank you so much, Megan, for being here today. And we know that you'll have an amazing journey tomorrow. joined by our colleague Nathan Cullen, who's the MP for Skeena-Bulkley Valley, so it's going to be pretty amazing. And we're taking all of this back to Ottawa to continue this fight, and that's for sure. So we're going to break into the 6 groups, and these are the 6 groups. And I'm hoping that, I hope you guys were aware of this beforehand, that you are each co-facilitating one of the groups with one of the MPs who's still here. So hopefully there's enough of us to go around. So in this part here, if you're interested in Enbridge specifically, then you're going to gather at the back over there. The second group, if you're more interested in what's going on with Kinder Morgan, then you're going to gather at the front here. In the middle, if you're interested generally in what this all means about increased tanker traffic, you're going to gather here. And at the back, in the middle, will be grassroots organizing. So if you're interested in, like, what the heck are we going to do about all of this? How do we get organized? Then in the middle at the back. And over on my left, if you're interested more specifically in the impact on fisheries, then you're going to meet at the front in a group. And if you're interested in the impact on First Nations, then that group will meet at the back on the far left. So I think what we'll do is we'll begin with the Enbridge group, which was the group that was meeting here, who is going to give us a brief summary. And if you would like to use the microphone in the middle, that would be great. And if you feel like telling us who you are, that would be great too. So again, this is the Enbridge group.
Hey everyone. Hey everyone. My name is Chad Wilkinson. I'm a resource ecologist specializing in aquatic ecology. And I was with the Enbridge group, and we sat down, the 6 of us, to talk about Enbridge and why we thought it was important to specifically go to that group. And we kind of identified a bunch of different reasons. In general, we could sort of summarize them as this idea of short-term gain, no respect for future generations, the jeopardy, of course, to BC's environment, the lack of understanding or following through with the principles of sustainable development, the inability to promote job growth in Canada by keeping resources in Canada and putting through some value-added approach so that we can actually generate more jobs in Canada and BC, and finally, how do we get back the power? So in the end of our discussion, we kind of formulated a bunch of questions that we thought were critical in the analysis of understanding what is the likelihood of this project actually getting built. The first one, I think, is the most important. We want to address directly to our MPs who have the best understanding of, federal legislation in regards to Bill C-38 and how it has changed the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act. So, and of course the National Energy Board. So the big question is, how can the JRP decision be retroactivated for this project and according to Bill C-38, because of course the decision was to be made in the fall of 2013. Can it now be reactivated so that the JRP hearings can be shortened and they could actually happen before the provincial election in BC? That's a big one, because obviously that puts me on to the next question. Oh yeah, somebody can answer or no? Okay. So
just put out the question.
So that puts me on to my next question, and the next question is, of course, if the BC government is changed to an NDP government, there's, of course, as most people are aware, Gordon Campbell agreed with SIA and the National Energy Board to relinquish any role that British Columbia would have in the environmental assessment process. So the BC Environmental Assessment Act is not being applied to Northern Gateway. I don't know if anyone knew that, and the EAO has no involvement currently. But if in that agreement that was put forward, there was a clause to rescind if we gave 30 days notice. So in other words, if Adrian Dix gets elected and it's within 30 days of the JRP decision, then we can rescind that and force a provincial environmental assessment onto this project, which currently does not have one. And then the next question on top of that is, can First Nations delay the project legitimately through appeals to the Supreme Court of Canada? And what are the mechanisms by which First Nations would be able to delay the project. Would it be these appeals cases only, or could it be other things like the fact that the First Nations have signed on to it, the declaration, the Save the Fraser Declaration? And then the very final question for us is, with respect to the EAO, if the EAO does actually get an opportunity to conduct an environmental assessment, now that we've heard from the Minister from the Provincial NDP, or sorry, the Critic from the Provincial NDP, does the EAO have the capacity to credibly conduct an EA?
Thank you very much, Chad. They're excellent questions. Very good. And again, this would be a very good reason to sign the sign-in sheet so that we can keep people posted and we can get back to people with what our best assessment of some of these questions are. So thank you for raising them. Okay, next, the Kinder Morgan group, which I believe were at the... No, you guys were at the front, were you?
We were at the front?
Yeah.
Yep.
Peter?
Yep. Okay, we had a very interesting discussion with a series of questions, just like the group with Enbridge that came out at the beginning. What level of government should folks address concerns around the Kinder Morgan project to, the federal, provincial, or municipal? What is the implication around the BC provincial election and the possibility, given that Kinder Morgan is the same route, can a BC independent environmental assessment apply? Do we allow dangerous goods such as the product that Kinder Morgan will be bringing in? What kinds of plans could Kinder Morgan make to change if there is a lot of opposition from the Lower Mainland? For example, the issue of Cherry Point was discussed. What are the implications to the right-of-way? So those are the kinds of questions that came up at the beginning. There was then some good discussion around some of the approaches that need to be taken, looking at the issue of oil sands and what is the actual economic viability around that, and to what extent we could be looking at a product that essentially has no economic long-term viability. The public education should be very important. Contact with First Nations is extremely important to get that public education undertaken and out. The social media, of course, is a primary component of making sure that the message is out and distributed. The idea came up as well about getting meetings between communities that have had to cope with oil spills, either through pipelines or tankers, and those that might be on the route. And one of the participants said at the end, really what's important is going to every level of government and above all voting and making sure your voice counts. That was,
thank you very much, Peter. I think we'll hear next from the increased tanker traffic.
Hi, my name's Linda. Our group was a little bit more dispersed in terms of the kinds of discussion we had. We raised a number of questions and there was some good discussion on each of those individual questions. Some of the questions that came up, one of them was exactly what are the concerns regarding the tankers on the coast. We talked about the impact to coastal communities and the concerns regarding fisheries. And the concern was also raised that expanding the tar sands represents not just the Kinder Morgan and the Enbridge pipelines, but perhaps even the potential for future pipelines coming down in the future. The woman, I'm sorry, I can't remember her name, from Living Oceans, talked a little bit about the specific concerns relating to tankers. She talked about how tankers can break up under stress and how there's historical evidence of tankers leaking all over the world. Apparently, the risk of a major spill is one along the BC coast was 1 in every 12 years, and that was before the Enbridge pipeline. So 1 in every 12 years is obviously a major concern. She also pointed out that on the Living Oceans website that there's a map of spills and leaks, and so that might be an interesting resource for people to take a look at. Something else that was pointed out was that, related to that map, we've only had 3 years of bitumen tanker traffic in the Strait of Georgia. Before that, we were dealing with a different type of oil. And so bitumen raises some very specific concerns as related to tanker traffic. The fellow from Western Canada Wilderness Committee talked about how the oil industry talks about normal operating conditions. And this includes actually ongoing leakage from pipelines. And this, by the oil industry, is considered to be normal and acceptable. And this is over and above major leaks. And this normal leakage is leaking into our streams and lakes, and this is already of concern even without two new added pipelines. We talked a little bit about the specific concerns related to bitumen oil. It's heavier, it'll sink, and it includes toxic chemicals that are added and are required to make the oil flow in the pipelines, to enable it to flow in the pipelines. The fellow from WC Squared talked about, it's time to start looking at one of two directions. Which direction are we going to go into in the future? Are we going to expand the tar sands and continue with a fossil fuel future, or are we going to look for alternatives? And he talked about the importance of investing in transportation solutions. And finally, we talked a little bit about jobs and the whole concern about jobs. And the concern about jobs, of course, is that obviously the opposition, well, not the opposition, the Conservatives are going to talk about how these pipelines are going to bring jobs. Obviously, the opposition is going to have to build up the case for how jobs are going to be created or lost, I should say, if there are leaks, if there are spills. In fact, with tourism and recreation and all of those kinds of things, there are more jobs that will be retained by not having those spills happen. And so from a jobs analysis point of view, the pipelines do not make sense. In particular for two resources was Mark Lee's analysis of jobs and also Robin Allen's analysis of jobs. One last point, somebody raised an interesting point that there's a need for a graphic display of the dangers of what happens all the way along the routing of these pipelines. In other words, it crosses a stream. What are the particular risks at that stream? Then it crosses maybe a lake or a highway or goes through a community. What are the specific risks there? Some kind of graphic display is needed where people can actually see this is what could happen in my community. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Linda. That's great. And there is a great study published by the BC CCPA called Enbridge Pipe Dreams and Nightmares, which really does get into a very good analysis on the situation with jobs and shows what a poor investment it is from a jobs point of view, so people can go check that out. So could we hear from the First Nations Impact Group?
My name is Raven Taylor, and I'm reporting
What's
back.
your name?
Raven Taylor.
Raven? Okay.
I'm reporting for the First Nations group. So we had a general discussion about how this will impact First Nations communities across BC, and we recognize that every community may have different responses and it be impacted quite differently depending on where they are situated. But there was a need for us to all work together to tackle the issues. And generally what came out of our discussion, because there's a lot of complex issues involved, was that there's a need for all of us to support First Nations opposition and participation in community consultations and environmental assessments. A need for solidarity across all groups, First Nations and all other communities. But also specifically solidarity with First Nations resistance to Enbridge, Kinder Morgan, and the Pipeline Project. One, because First Nations are particularly empowered related to land use and treaty processes, but also more vulnerable to attack from the federal government. And also there's a need for us to all work together to develop a strategy, both federally, provincially, municipally, and in all First Nations communities. So again, it brings it back to support and solidarity.
Thank you very much. And I left the grassroots organizing till the last, because you guys are going to tell us what we're going to do. So who is going to report out from that group? So give us the list of what we're going to do.
Well, we had a large and energetic group, which is great because that's exactly what we're going to need to do to stop this, these projects. I think really what came out of our group was a big need to better coordinate and facilitate or give resources to all the people out there that are interested in getting involved in the campaign, because right now there are so many people interested in this issue and doing something about it that the groups that are working on it don't necessarily have enough resources to reach all those people. So we're looking for ways to better do that. And that is kind of the bottom line from our group.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, there's a lot of questions that were raised, and so I do want to say that we will do our very best to, first of all, to help bring about coordination, and we are working very closely with our provincial counterparts in the BC NDP, and obviously it's very critical that we stay in close contact with ENGOs, with First Nations. We all have different roles here to play. Some of it is legislative, some of it is on the street, some of it is legal, some of it is public education. I mean, we get an idea that there are many different levels of how we respond to this issue. And so I do want to say for the BC NDP members of Parliament that we're very, very committed to following this up. Peter, our natural resources critic, and Megan, who you heard from, there are two lead people, as well as Donnelly, our fisheries critic. So we will be following up, and we really, really appreciate people coming out this afternoon, and especially to our panelists for sharing their time. This is going to be a huge issue when we go back to Parliament in September, as it will be over the summer. And I think Ben gave just a little tip of information about there's going to be an incredible amount of events organized over the summer by the Wilderness Committee, so certainly look for that. So this is something that we can all get involved in. So I hope that we leave today with, one, a sense that we have some good information. This was about information sharing. Two, that you have a sense that we're engaged, as Megan said. We're here to listen, but more than that, we're also here to act. And three, we have to know how to work together. It doesn't mean, you know, we take over people's turf or anything. It's respecting space, but there's a lot of commonality here, so it's learning how to work together and to do that really, really well. Because when we do that, as we've seen with other struggles in BC, whether it's over labor rights or environmental issues or social justice issues, that when we have that kind of bigger picture and that sense of a strong coalition on the ground, it really works. I mean, that's what gets us through, and that's what will push Stephen Harper and his god-awful plan back. So I hope you go away from today's meeting with a sense of hope and optimism that that's something that we can do. It's not just, you know, pie in the sky, or it's not all defeated. This is an opportunity for the people of BC to speak out and to speak for our province and for future generations, and to respect First Nations and their rights. So thank you so much for coming. Sign the sheet if you want to stay informed. Pick up the postcards, sign the petition, and let's keep working on this issue together. Thank you very much.
And I want to say, this reminds me of a quote by Margaret Mead, who stated, "Never doubt that a small group of people can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing